when you look at the conflict right now in Gaza, we've seen that the Israeli Minister of Justice trying to force Netanyahu to escalate the situation, to attack Rafah. How do you see the Biden's policy in Gaza? How do you see the Netanyahu's policy in this conflict?
Well, I think what you're watching is best understood by not doing what we call here in the United States getting lost in the weeds. And you don't see the big picture, you get lost in the little details. So I'm going to try to answer your question by talking about the big picture. Israel is one of the last, if not the last, effort at what we call settler colonialism. Settler colonialism. That's when a group of people, sometime in the last 4 centuries, the history of capitalism, a group of people settle in a colonial territory. So the British government or the Dutch government or somebody else takes over some land, usually with military force, and then to make it a paying proposition. And remember, the goal in colonial situations was to make the colony pay for its own colonization. So, for example, the first book I ever wrote was about British colonialism in East Africa. And they made the people of East Africa grow coffee, the single most important product, Arabica coffee, grown in the highlands in the middle of Kenya. Okay, they needed labor, so they made the Africans live in reserved areas where they could not sustain themselves. There wasn't enough land. There wasn't enough place for animals. So the only way to survive would go to be and work on the coffee farm of the colonial British who came in, got the land for next to nothing, and were now provided with the labor and could sell their coffee back into London. Okay, so that was a settler colonialism. Australia is another one. New Zealand is another one. South Africa is another one. Canada and the United States are also. What you notice, though, in the list I just gave you, is that the settlers found themselves sooner or later in a oppositional position with the local population. And so what began to happen was the systematic destruction of those local people. So, for example, again, using my example of Kenya, it eventually produced in the early 1950s something called the Mau Mau Rebellion of Black Africans rising up against the British. And it forced the British out. A few years after that, even though they slaughtered huge numbers of African people, by that time it was over. They knew, and the British had to leave. Here in the United States, same thing. Ethnic cleansing is what the settlers eventually did. They destroyed, literally by mass killing, the native or indigenous people. The few that remain are still to this day stuck, many of them, on reservations where they can barely make a living. Indigenous Americans are among the poorest, the least healthy, the most riddled with crime and alcohol and all the rest. It became, after they were done, it became a new world in which ethnic cleansing and the slaughter of indigenous people was no longer celebrated. In the 17th, 18th, 19th century, the British thought they were bringing God and civilization and progress and modernity to India or to Pakistan or to fill in the blank. But nowadays, everybody not everybody, but almost everybody understands that that's not what was going on, that there was money being made It was a standard joke in England that if you could not be successful in your career in England, you could always go to the colonies, and there you would become a gentleman farmer because all the work was done by the masses in India and so forth, okay? The problem for Israel is that it's trying to do the same thing, but it's doing it too late. The world is not what it was. The balance of forces is not what it was. You can't do in the 21st century what was common in the 18th and 19th centuries. Nobody should be surprised at that. But there's deep in the Israeli population a sense of the hypocrisy of the British or the Americans or the Australians wanting them to make a deal. Well, they didn't make a deal. There's no two-state solution for the Maori people in New Zealand or the Aboriginal people in Australia or the indigenous people in the United States and Canada. Not at all. No two-state solution. They couldn't even vote in elections here until a few years ago. So they don't have most civil rights, and on and on and on. So that's the first problem. Israel is caught in a historic impossibility. The world will not tolerate what the Israelis are doing. The very people who did it themselves 200 years ago are now not willing to watch it unfold here. Yes, for the first few months, they all looked away and pretended they didn't have to, but now, and you know why? Because the rest of the world, the Arab world, the Muslim world, and the whole world watching this slaughter is horrified. You can't be telling anybody that they're bringing God or modernity or anything else. You are slaughtering the people in order to take the land. That's what it's about. And the rest of the world protests. And that makes it very hard for the Western world, Australia, New Zealand, and the rest of them to pretend that they can be neutral. They can't. They can't. So that's the first problem. Israel's project is a historical impossibility. You cannot do it now. And wherever they draw the red line, whether it's going into the camp at Rafah, or whether it is, by the way, attacking a consulate in Damascus of the Iranian government without any provocation that anybody has been able to point to, just as an act of war in a non-war situation when you're already at war somewhere else. This is crazy stuff. And the world looks at it that way. And if they take the troops out of Gaza and put them against Hezbollah in the north and against Lebanon and so on, it'll be the same. You can't do this now. And the Israelis are discovering they can't. Mr. Biden has been pro-Israel all of his life. He collects huge amounts of money from pro-Israeli donors here in the United States. He has all his alliances built around that. And you could see what he did. He was 100% for Israel. Yeah, now he's 42% for Israel. Why? Has he changed his mind? Of course not. But he sees all around the world the signs of a changed situation. He miscalculates because he doesn't understand the big picture. You and I have discussed this. He miscalculated, and the people around him and the European leaders, they didn't understand what they were doing going to war against Russia. The war against Russia, they are losing that war. and there's no sign of changing. They have escalated over and over again. They would never send in tanks. They did. They would never send in surface-to-air missiles. They did. They would never send in F-15 fighter planes. They did. Now they will never send troops on the ground. They probably will. None of it works. None of it works. Here's another sign. The whole world is supporting mostly Hamas, not Israel. Therefore, they miscalculated. They thought they could destroy Hamas. They can't. Every time they kill somebody, and they call everybody they kill Hamas, every time they kill somebody, 3 more people become Hamas because they saw their mother being killed or they saw their child being destroyed. You are creating more Hamas with every day. This is crazy. This is a policy that is self-destructive, but you can't see it in the minds of many in Israel. They can't see it any more than the Americans could see that the Russians could and would mount a serious war effort, and not just serious militarily, but serious politically, serious diplomatically, serious, ideologically. They miscalculated. Those are the 2 major wars right now, Gaza and Ukraine, and the West miscalculated both of them. And no, those are not isolated incidents. They miscalculated in Iraq. They miscalculated in Afghanistan. The Taliban run Afghanistan. It's very clear. And the biggest winner in the Iraq-Iran situation is Iran, who's supposedly an enemy. I mean, and you're not seeing any adjustment. They can't see what is happening. So the biggest problem is a change in the world that these people have set themselves against. And if a relatively small group of people, Israeli Jews, are a small number, whatever it is, 6 million, 8 million, whatever the number is, but they're not strong enough to take on the whole world. And it's an illusion and a delusion for them to imagine that they can do that. They can't do it militarily. They can't do it economically. They can't do it politically. They can't even subdue the people of Gaza. And Mr. Biden miscalculated even in his own country. He thought that this country would be unanimously pro-Israeli. Not true. To the surprise of many, and I admit I'm one of them. I'm surprised at the amount of American sympathy for Gaza, for the Palestinians, including many American Jews, many. And Mr. Biden is therefore confronted with having insisted we're with you 100%, and now he has to retreat. It's going to hurt him in the election. It's going to hurt him a lot. He may still win, but he is worried. That's the only reason he is telling Mr. Netanyahu, you better adjust. And Mr. Netanyahu is talking, I'm sure, to Mr. Trump.
Erdogan, who was so tough when he was talking about Israel, but he didn't do anything. And his party has lost. It seems that he's changing his policy toward Israel. Turkey is imposing export restrictions to Israel. Just today, they announced that on 54 products, including jet fuel, engine oil, chemicals, and many other things. On the other hand, we see that 68% of Israelis are supporting this policy in Gaza. It seems to me that they're not understanding. At the end of the day, they have to get along with these countries.
Well, let's remember, their power has always been dependent on and sustained by the power of the United States. But they don't understand any more than the leaders in the United States that the power position of the United States is not today what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And that therefore the support for Israel that they used to assume is now, this is a terrible shock to them. They don't know what to do. They cannot go against the United States. The United States provides 2/3 of their military equipment. Germany provides about 25% and Italy the rest. That's it. That's who's, and all of these countries, all of them, even Germany, have large movements now that are not in favor. When the Houthis began to throw missiles on the ships in the Red Sea, what I said to people was this: every Arab community that is sympathetic to Palestine, which is almost every one of them, every Muslim community around the world that watches the West smashing a Muslim population in a very unfair battle there, they are all looking for ways to push back at Israel. And even if they don't want to and are afraid of the Israelis, and many of them are, they have their own internal population. Mr. Erdogan lost an election for the control of Istanbul, and he lost in many of the other larger cities. Now, this is an old struggle in Turkey, but it is hurting him. And the people he needs to mobilize want him to do something about the Palestinian. So now he's worried. For his own reasons, he now has to do what the Houthis did in terms of Yemen. But that's not the end of it. There are people in Pakistan who want that government to do something, and in Bangladesh and in Indonesia. What is Israel going to do all by itself? With an America that is looking longer and longer, we don't want that. This is an impossible situation for them. And so they hold on, which frightened people often do. They hold on to the old idea that they can strongly attack, in this case, the Palestinians. They feel that the Palestinians hate them, which has a lot of truth to it, and that they are in danger from those Palestinians. That's also true. The problem is they have to face that they cannot do what they're now doing. But their frustration is they don't know what else to do. Time is not on their side. They need to settle that land. They need to push those Palestinians off the land, bring in people to settle the land so that they have some chance of saying, well, yes, the history was not so good, but here we are. We're planting our olive trees and we have our settlements. I mean, they should have learned by now that destroying the Palestinians doesn't work. Savagely repressing them doesn't work. Bombing the crap out of their cities and towns, which is what they've done the last 6 months, it's not going to work either. What are they doing? But again, I don't want to get lost in Mr. Netanyahu is trying to stay out of jail. Yes, I'm sure he is. And Israeli politics are now dominated by the right wing. Yes, true enough. But I think those are the surface. Below that is a contradiction that to be a settler colonial society, having to destroy the mass of the indigenous people, this is a project that the world today will not allow. And I don't deny that it's taking the Arab countries a long time to do something. They yell and they scream and they vote in the UN, But you're right, they don't do very much. But my guess is there's a lot that they're doing we don't see because they don't want us to see it. And that makes sense. I think Hamas is surprising everybody by the fact that it's still there. I mean, they have the support of the people, but they also have the weapons. They also have the friends abroad. They are putting up more of a resistance than was. And if Israel attacks Hezbollah, they're going to have a war on two sides. It can be very difficult for them. And the Israeli economy is a bad joke now. It's like the Ukraine economy. It's not there. It's dependent more and more on the United States at the same time that the United States, mostly for internal reasons, cannot keep doing this. I don't see a way out for the Israelis, just like I don't see a way out in the war in Ukraine. The Russians have said, we are not going to lose this war. And the West has so far said, we're not going to lose this war. And they have both said they won't use nuclear weapons, or at least they won't be the first to use nuclear weapons. Well, if you're not going to use nuclear weapons, and neither side is going to let the other side win, then what are you saying? You're saying this is an endless war. You know, that's what I see. Israel is caught up in an endless war. But I'm afraid if I look at it all, the odds are the West will cave in because the cost of an endless war in the West is not worth it. Whereas the cost of that war for Russia is worth it. And in the end, I would therefore bet on Russia, but you never be sure. And the same is true in Israel. They can fight forever, but what kind of society is that? Look, I know from the United States, here's a statistic. More young men who serve in the American military die by suicide when they come back home than die in the war. The Israelis have been committing unspeakable behavior. That's going to affect Israel. Israel has a huge opposition inside the country that talks about what is going on and is against it. The Israelis are going to have to work that out, and that's going to be an incredibly difficult thing for them to do. That's why I know quite a few people in and out of Israel who say, and it's not just political rhetoric, but who say with real intensity that the greatest damage imaginable is being done to the Israelis. They're not suffering the bombs. I don't want to compare it. The suffering of the Palestinians is for sure the horror, the worst of this whole story, no question. But the Israelis are damaging their position, which is a minority position in a small corner of the world. You cannot survive if you have gone from the victim of a Holocaust to becoming the perpetrator of a Holocaust. And that's what's happening to the reputation of Israel around the world. And that is going to be an unbelievable burden for a country that already has lots of problems.
Richard, if the United States, the Senate, the Congress decide to sanction Turkey in response to what they're doing right now to Israel, how do you see the future of relationship between the United States and Turkey? Do you think that would convince Turkey to go to the opposite side, to BRICS?
Probably. I think that's the most likely outcome. But we already see that. Turkey was once a very strong ally of NATO and the West. It's already changed all of that. The movement towards Islam, the fact that an Erdogan could become the leader, despite the history of Ataturk and the other secular part of Turkey. You know, the people who won the election last week, that's the same old secular, Europe looking, modern, urban against the mullah, you know, against the rural, the village, the church, all of that. That continues to play out, you know, with the addition of the ethnic issues, but put them aside for a minute. So there's already a lot of push in Turkey to go east, to go further into the Muslim, to struggle inside, and that may lead Erdogan to go in that direction, especially if a growing, see, this is the key thing, if a growing part of the Turkish middle class, the Turkish bourgeoisie, the Turkish industrialists, the Turkish banks, the Turkish merchants, if they see participating in BRICS as a reasonable objective that they can do to replace the business they lose in Europe and North America and Japan, they then will move, and then it's over. Then Turkey will join the BRICS and be allied with Saudi Arabia and with Egypt and so on as an Arab bloc within the BRICS. And that's the fear of the United States. But if, of course, they sanction him, then I think they understand probably that they've lost him. Their only hope then would be to mobilize the business community in Turkey. And they would then what would happen is that they would begin to demonize Erdogan. And they would do that in a way, the way they did it with Putin, the way they did it with Saddam Hussein. He will become a monster. He will become a religious, right-wing, extreme Islamicist. He'll become an enemy of progress. He will be the oppressor of women. He will, you know, you could see it all coming. And that will be the effort to pressure the middle class of Turkey to turn against. They don't like him anyway. So they turn against him even more. And then you have the Maidan. The CIA will come in, find somebody who's popular in Turkey to rise up and lead a movement to get rid of Erdogan. That might work. But that's what's left to them. That's what's left. And you know, for the way the United States is functioning, it is producing more and more enemies with more and more reason to get together in hostility against the United States. You can't keep doing this without producing your own downfall. The big picture of the United States is that the empire that it once had from 1945, let's say, to 1990, it's over. What collapsed in 1989 was not only the Soviet Union, but with it, the dominant position of the United States. That too began to collapse. The peak, when it was a unipolar hegemonic power, that peak was also the beginning of the decline. And until that is understood, which it is not, and accepted, which it is not, you will continue to have leaders that make unbelievable miscalculations because they're not seeing this big picture because it is so frightening. You know, I repeat, every empire the world has ever seen was born, evolved, and changed over time, and then it died. The American empire was born, we know where, when, and how. It has evolved over time. We know about that. So that we all know what the next step is. It's finished. The only question is not whether. It's only a question of when and exactly how. And what's going on is we're living through the early stages of that decline. And so what we see and there's much understanding of this in the field of psychology, what we see is denial. The reaction, this is not, we are powerful, we are still, we are losing in Ukraine and we are losing in Gaza. And there's no amount of twisting and turning at this point that makes that untrue. Is the United States still powerful? Yes. Is it still very rich? Yes. Could it turn around these societies? Probably. But it can't do it to all of them. And there's now a fundamental new reality. There's more wealth gathered in the hands of the BRICS than is gathered in the hands of the G7. And this has to be an enormous change that is going to shape everything that happens, whether it be Ukraine or Gaza or any other corner of the world.
Richard, I want to talk about a very political subject that John Mearsheimer always talking about it. He says that might makes right. This is the term he uses all the time. And when I don't understand his obsession with China, when he talks about China, when he criticizes the war in Ukraine, he says, no, we didn't have to go to this war with Russia because we need Russia to fight against China. Where does it come from, this type of mindset? Why they're thinking this way, in your opinion? Why we need to have an enemy? Why we cannot live together, in your opinion?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we can, and I'm going to give you in a few minutes some examples of where we have done that. So don't be so quick to accept the premise. Mearsheimer is a very smart man and has much to teach us, and especially in that field of international relations, where most of it is really poor journalism. That's about it. He brings a much more refreshing, serious, analytical mind to it all. Let me take an example from the United States. And we can see it by going back for a moment to settler colonialism. I remember taking my children when they were younger to a small town in western Massachusetts. The name of the town, Old Deerfield. And in the town of Old Deerfield, they've done something very interesting. They've reconstructed the way houses looked in the colonial time, the early time, before the United States was a country, before we were independent, when we were an early new colony of Great Britain. Okay? And if you walk through the town, very interesting, the way the houses inside and outside, historians and archaeologists have reconstructed an old colonial village, a tourist attraction. So it's interesting, it's different, and I thought it might interest my children, which it did. But there was also something horrifying, because there are little signs in front, I believe, of each house. There's a little sign about what happened here in 1742, or whatever the year was. And the sign read like this: on the 18th of July, in the evening, the savages came and slaughtered 2 women and 4 children and a goat. The next house. Here, there was a hanging of savages that were caught stealing cows or horses. Next house. The savage, and I remember explaining to my children something that's very bizarre. The Europeans come 3,000 miles across the water from where they were born, from where they grew up in Europe, come 3,000 miles and enter the territory in which local people have been living for thousands of years, take their land, kill many of them, but they are the savages. Everything that happened in colonial New England was contextualized by the danger to the community posed by the evil other. Evil others have been part of American life from the beginning. You had to make savages of these people, because if you didn't make them savages, what would they be? And the answer is victims. Victims of, they didn't come to Europe. Europeans came to them. They didn't take the land from the Europeans. The Europeans took the land from them. The Israelis have this problem. The Palestinians didn't go to Europe. The European Jews mostly came to that part of the world. And they had more money and they had more connections, blah, blah, blah. And so you have a problem here. For the Jews, again, I just want to make the parallel. For the Jews in Israel, how are they going to look at the Palestinians? They could, the way the Palestinians do, they could say, look how poor their income is. Look how bad their diet is. Look how early in life they die. Look at how ill they are. Look at how poor their homes are. Then they become maybe victims. But who would they be victims of? Israeli Jews. So it's impossible. You can't live with this. So they become savages. They're the ones, you're not threatening them, they are threatening you. And everything you're doing is defense. Everything the Israeli army does is identified by the letters IDF, the Israeli Defense. They are defending. They went crazy after October 7th because Hamas attacked them. They actually were victimized, just a few of them, 1,200, terrible. But there was, for that moment, the real, and it touched a nerve in these people. They feel victimized, even if they weren't hurt when those Hamas people attacked on the 7th, even if they weren't there, even if their family wasn't there. They felt the anger and bitterness of the Palestinian population, now expressed by Hamas, and we must and we have the right to defend ourselves, and we will destroy those who want to destroy us. Hamas is a very good target for them because Hamas actually has a position of getting rid of Israel. Just like there were some indigenous people in colonial New England who hated these Europeans. Given what the Europeans did, how could it be otherwise? And look at it too. In Ukraine, those people are dealing with the Russians as evil, dangerous, outside, savage threats. That's it. Otherwise, they would have to take seriously what the Russians are saying, which is, you attack the Russian-speaking people in the eastern part of Ukraine, and we're not going to let you do it, and we're not going to let you get NATO equipment and bombs and make it all. We're not going to let you do that. We're not. And it's a defense idea. And the Ukrainians do not want to understand themselves as having been maneuvered into a project of NATO. Again, that they don't want that. They want the Russians to be bad. And really all they have to hang on to is that the Russians did come first. The Russians crossed the border, and that's an issue, and that they have the right to bring that up. That's not the point. The point is, notice this procedure in which you feel yourself to be so close to evil and terrible that you have to put all of that on to somebody else. The Israelis know what the Palestinians think about Israel. They don't want Israel there. They feel abused by Israel. They feel their land was taken. And there's a lot of truth to all of that. But the Israelis cannot stay there and be the oppressor. So they have to do something. And what they've done, which is what those colonial people in New England did, was to make the other one savage. It's a little bit like, for the United States, we always needed an enemy. When we didn't have the native people to be the savages that we're in danger of, we fought a war against the colonial master, King George III, who dictated, we didn't want that, 1776, again in 1812. The British Empire, thinking itself the empire upon which the sun never sets, thought they could easily squash their own British people who had become a settler colony in North America. They made a terrible mistake. They lost the war in 1776, and they lost the war in 1812. But now to show you, after that war was lost, the British slowly, with lots of disagreement, came to a recognition. You cannot beat the United States into submission. You better work out a way that Britain can grow and develop, and that the United States can grow and develop. And they did that. That was achieved. No more wars between the United States and Britain ever again. The last one, 1812. That's 200 years of no war between them, even though they had wars between them before. And during that period, the bulk of the 19th century and into the 20th century, both Britain and the United States grew, prospered, and developed. The United States grew, prospered, and developed more, faster. So in the end, the British colonial government and the little colony reversed their situation. And the little colony became the dominant economic empire, and Britain became a small, cold, wet island off the mainland of Europe, which is what it is now. So they went through an enormous, difficult role reversal, but they did not fight a war. They did not destroy each other in endless combat. So yeah, you can come to another solution. Whether the Chinese mean it or not, I don't know. I'm no expert on China, and I'm not pretending or have any interest in pretending that their motives aren't complicated and so forth. But I don't see them running around the world fighting wars. They're not provoking wars. The United States is provoking war in Taiwan. You could see Taiwan from China. You can't see it from the United States. What in the world is going on? Sending troops to Taiwan, sending military equipment. What are you doing? Again? Again? The United States must have believed in the days when Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon opened up China and brought them into the WTO, that they could control how China developed. They couldn't, because colonialism is over. It's not coming back. It's done. But they didn't understand it. So China, with a goal of developing quickly, made some experiments. They tried the Soviet system. Government owned and operated the enterprise. They tried let's call it the Scandinavian system. Lots of government regulation, but basically private enterprise, private capitalism. And all that the Chinese did with their experiments, very practical, is they came up with a hybrid, an economy that is half public, owned and operated by the Chinese government, and half private capitalist enterprises, some Chinese, some Japanese, American, European, 50-50. Nobody's done that before. Russia was overwhelmingly, Soviet Union was overwhelmingly government owned and operated. Britain and England, overwhelmingly private. And then mixtures before. But the Chinese are the first really big company to really kind of 50-50 and control the whole thing by a powerful government run by an even more powerful Communist Party. Okay, I'm not, there are problems with this. There are injustices that are wrapped up. One can make all kinds of criticism, and I believe in social criticism, and it doesn't stop at China's door. But that's no excuse not to see what China has done. It has taken the largest population on the earth and pulled them out of poverty in one generation. No one has ever done that before. It took centuries to do that in Western Europe, North America, and Japan. Now, we have much to learn from that. And the Chinese seem willing, from what they say, and so far from what they do, to demand the right to develop their economy, but to be willing to sit down and work it out, as Britain and the United States were able to do in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. So I don't think we need to be, Mearsheimer's might makes right. It's not always this, conflict. And if you have more battleships and you have more troops, you win. I mean, does that happen sometimes? Of course. Is it a necessity? No, 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 no. Look, Europe suffered unbelievably in World Wars I and II. After World War I, they tried to develop a way to stop it, the League of Nations. That failed. After World War II, they tried again. This time they called it the United Nations. And while the United Nations has loads of problems, we haven't seen another world war. Okay, that's something. Let's see where we can go with that. One of the effects of that has been producing a generation, including today, that is very nervous about another war. It's difficult for the governments of Germany, France, Britain, Italy to mobilize to fight the Russians. There are a lot of people who don't want to go anywhere near there. They remember what their grandmother told them about what life was like during World War II or I. So these wars last a long time, leave deep scars, shaping politics for a long time. Israel is going to learn that lesson again in very painful ways as the Arab countries and the Muslim countries lead the way in finding opportunities to push back, to show their own people we are helping the Palestinians. We're not politicians who say one thing and do something else. And they will discover ways of working out your situation. And again, because the BRICS are now a larger, richer economic unit, there is the economic motive that is going to make more and more countries unwilling to do the conflicting, challenging, confrontational foreign policy that the United States pursues. And I think most of the world sees it, and I really think this is true, as the United States being a declining empire that is terrified about it, doesn't want to face it, needs to act out roles of the big, powerful, and then doesn't understand why it seems to make these terrible mistakes, losing all these wars, spending all this money. A Chinese leader once said some years ago, you come here and you don't understand the simplest thing to an American visitor. Do you know how much you spend on military? You call it defense. You spend more than the next 9 countries combined, which includes both Russia and China. All right? We don't. We use that money to lift our people out of poverty. So here's the problem for you, Mr. American, said this Chinese person. The world is racing to see which is the more successful foreign policy. The one that lifts everybody out of poverty, or the one that has a military base in 700 places around the world? The jury is out on that question, is not at all clear. But what is clear is that the Chinese have been able to devote their resources to building up their economy, and they've done so in a way that no one has ever done before, and that has caught the United States unprepared and unable to do very much about it. And yeah, I'm not Mr. Mearsheimer's need. And as I say, I respect him. I've learned from him. This is not at all a critique. But his need to see it as a dead end, that there is no solution. I believe he likes to use the term a frozen war, and that somehow Ukraine will end up being a frozen war with a frozen Russian army confronting a frozen NATO army. They can't move forward. They're frozen, you know. And then he seems to think this will last forever. I don't believe that people on either side would tolerate this.